Welcome, Bruins, to Conversations with the Critically Conscious. In today's segment, we have a social justice leader challenge where we ask educators to reflect on their experiences and ask them to be action-minded. Today's topic, practicing critically conscious conversations. A few educators will model critical consciousness, but first, let's take a look at what it means.
Welcome to Critical Consciousness 101.
Critical consciousness is an awareness of yourself and your values, your beliefs and your dispositions, specifically as related to serving marginalized populations.
Social justice educators must, number one, know who they are as people. Secondly, understand the context in which they teach or lead. And third, intently question their knowledge base and assumptions. Scholars contend that consciousness is at the forefront of social justice leadership, and a true understanding of social justice is linked to three elements, one of which is critical consciousness. Why must we do this work? If school leaders are to prepare students to live as critical citizens in society, then we must hold ourselves accountable to have a critical consciousness, specifically about power, privilege, and inequality in our society and in our schools.
I experienced the past year and a half of the two global pandemics with the privilege of my proximity to whiteness. Dominant culture would deem my assistant principal job title as successful, but this success came at the cost of my suppressed identity through assimilation as the model minority. I am now a proud Korean American woman, but I rarely learned about my identity in my K-12 public education in Los Angeles and was taught to only speak English at school and to follow the status quo. As an adult, I began to learn about the myth of the model minority, understood my positionality in society and intersectionality, and began to realize that the Korean part of my Korean American identity is an asset and is something as worthy as being white or viewed in our dominant American culture. Today, I wonder who would I be today if my K-12 American education valued my whole identity and created a sense of belonging and agency. This process of critical consciousness has the power to guide our staff, students, families, and all stakeholders to challenge our current social and political systems that hold these hierarchies of power and privilege by activating our participation in political race. As school leaders, we can practice strategic activism by holding our inside positions with our job titles while staying grounded in our outside experience and the collective experience of those who are racially marginalized, to ultimately come to an understanding that no matter what our job title is or how we identify ourselves, we all have the collective efficacy and the linked fate to create a better world.
Being critically conscious will be imperative for all of us in the school community as we return from pandemic teaching. I am incredibly focused and passionate about the language program that we are building at my school, as well as the big long-term goals that we have. However, none of that will be possible without engaged students who feel seen and whose needs are being met. I look like many of my students, and my family upbringing was similar to that of my students. I also proudly live in the same city. However, I do not live in the same neighborhood. The school community is suffering from houselessness and rapid gentrification. There is very little healthy food and access to healthcare in the school community. These are all things which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. In addition to this, it will also be valuable for me to think about the cultural and linguistic goals that we have for our school program. Many times our celebrations to promote the target language on our school community can be exclusionary to other students on the campus. We must think critically and carefully about how our well-intentioned plans often leave some students out. As we return, we as educators must recognize the privilege with which we come to school each day. We must think about where our students come from, who they are, and what needs they have that they must have met before we can dive into the big academic goals.
As our students return to campus, I need to be very aware of my positionality and my privilege. As a white middle-class woman, I was able to safely navigate the pandemic with little disruption to my overall well-being. My students, however, are coming from a very different perspective. They have experienced so much trauma. They have experienced loss, food and housing insecurities, trauma, fear. There is vaccine hesitancy in our community. There are racial inequities and a fear in our community. Our kiddos need the space to reintegrate back into schools and systems that have consistently failed them. My position is one where I must listen to my students, to connect with their families, and to create spaces of joy that reflect my students and their culture.
Critical consciousness is a bridge that links schools with activism. This framework is especially essential for educators who work with Black, Indigenous students of color, as it asks us to be actively aware of the systems which marginalize our students and create change. School leaders must exemplify this foundation to ensure each teacher is addressing it within their own classroom. Teachers who are able to foster critical consciousness amongst their students will aid in their development to becoming cognizant individuals. By encouraging our students to gain a sense of awareness of the social, historical, and political forces that create inequitable conditions, we are challenging them to dismantle the systems which uphold those conditions. According to Bell McKenzie et al., schools can foster critical consciousness by doing the following. Number 1, engaging their staff in a dialogue that raises their critical consciousness about the racial oppression going on in their schools. Number 2, teachers can encourage their students in collecting history of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and ability within their community. Number 3, teachers can assign activist-centered projects in which students volunteer and participate in action research activities in community agencies and social service centers that have a social justice focus. And finally, number 4, for aspiring principals, neighborhood walks and spending time with low-income families to learn about their needs are suggested.
Thank you for being part of this segment of Critical Conversations. Be brave, Bruins. Stay brave, Bruins.